Alright, so today we're going to talk about two technologies that are part of JavaScript or related to it. The first one is AJAX. Now AJAX is a set of technologies basically that allows us to retrieve information from a server, whether it's our own server or a remote server, and display it on a web page without refreshing that page. So we can do it with JavaScript after the page loads. If someone submits, clicks a button or something like that, we can go request information and pull it back. AJAX is used a lot for like chat interfaces or stock tickers that pull in information constantly. If you've ever seen someone live blog an event like a product release or something like that, you can go to a page and just sit there, and as they post things, new content comes available. That's using AJAX, so that you don't have to constantly sit there and hit refresh all the time. So AJAX just allows us to pull information from somewhere else without refreshing the current page. And so we're going to look at some different ways we can do that. We're not going to start with JSBin because by default AJAX does not allow us to retrieve information remotely. Okay, now we will be able to. There's a workaround for that, but by default it doesn't. So we're actually going to look and use just a simple demo thing that we've got here. So as I put code in this top box, we're going to see the output in the bottom, and we're just going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to use jQuery to do this, and so of course we always have, when we have jQuery, we always start with our ready function. We execute our code inside that. Okay, so when we do that, there's a method called .get. Okay, now you'll notice that we're not using a selector here because we're not actually trying to apply this method to a particular element in the DOM. So we're not using something like this to actually assign it to anything. So we're just using $.get, and then we pass a couple arguments in, and the first argument that we pass in is what page are we trying to retrieve. Okay, so we're trying to retrieve a page that has some content on the server, and so we're trying to get that content. And so let's say we're trying to retrieve test.php. Okay, so I actually have a test.php on this server, and you'll see it's got some content in it. You'll notice if we look at the source of it, there's not any HTML tags. There could be, but you don't need it. This can be a snippet of HTML. Doesn't have to be a full HTML page with body tags and HTML head tags, anything like that. It can just be a block of text or HTML text. Okay, so this is, if we retrieve this page, this is the content of it, and so that's what we're trying to retrieve in our example. So at this point we've selected the page. We've used .get to select the page, but we want to actually return that information and do something with it. So we're going to use a method called done. And so what done is pretty much like it sounds like. As soon as it's done retrieving this page, this test.php, it's going to execute the function inside of done. So let's open this function up, close the function. Now we need some way to pass in the information that came from that page, and so done automatically will pass in, if we set an argument to receive it, we'll pass it in as an argument to our function. So in this case we're going to use an argument named data to pass that information in, so that in here we can actually do something with it. In this case we just want to output it on this page, so we'll just say body, just for a simple example, body append. So you can see down here in our demo, you can see it's starting to pull in now, and we've got the text that we wanted. So that's at its very simplest, that's all we're trying to do. But you can also do more than that. Instead of just retrieving static information, you can send variables just like you would with a form. You send information to a server for it to do something and return a result. We can send information in via this .get method as well. So let's go back and look at our test page, and we'll see that there's a script set up ahead of time that has some variables, and you can actually see a preview there. But let's say that we assign a variable a name, and these are using get variables. And I could say, let's see, I think we have 3 set up here. So I could say status equals teacher and rating equals fantastic. Okay, so when I pass in these variables, I've got a script set up that's going to change what's output. Okay, now we could have done this via a form, and we'll look at an example of doing it with a form in a little bit. But in this case, just showing you that we could change it by passing these variables in here. So in our example, we would pass those variables in as a JavaScript object. Okay, so we'd have an extra object here. If you remember, in previous examples, before we got into jQuery, we talked about objects, and we said that we could create one just by using these 2 brackets and defining some variables inside it. So in this case, I could say name is Stacy, comma, status is teacher, and rating is fantastic. And so you can see as we're adding these in, these are being passed to the, along with this page, the test.php, along with that we're passing these variables in just like we did over here in the URL. So now you can see our output down here is now just the same as it was when we passed them in over there. Okay, so this is pretty basic, and .get is going to pass these in exactly as a URL, but we also have talked about in the past, like in forms and stuff like that, that we can pass information in via post, and so you could actually do this with post as well, and it's going to work very similar. And there's different cases in which you need to use get versus post, but you're still passing the information in the same way. So these 2 methods are very, very similar. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at something called a JSON string. Okay, and when we say JSON, it's JSON, and it means JavaScript string object notation. And all that means is we're taking an object, it's a data format basically that is very similar to a JavaScript object. Okay, so if we look at what is a object, we actually had one over here. This is a great example of an object, so let's just go ahead and use that one. And we said we could assign it to a variable, and then we could alert out, say, object.name, and it's going to grab that information. So this is actually creating an object inside JavaScript that has, you know, these properties associated with it. But sometimes when we want to transfer information back and forth, you know, across servers or, you know, with AJAX or stuff like that, we want to have a data format. So JavaScript string object notation is a data format based on this very similar look as this, except it's a string. Okay, so a JSON string, we might say, is going to look very similar to this, except we're going to use double quotes around both the properties and their values. Now, most of the time when we're working with JavaScript, whether you use single quotes or double quotes doesn't matter, as long as you're consistent with opening and closing with the same thing. But when you come to JSON, it's a much stricter data format, and it expects them to be double quotes. Okay, so I've modified this. Now this format right here is considered a JSON string, and so we can pass that string, you know, between servers or between pages We can store it in a database. We can save it to a text file. And the advantage being is that there's a lot of different programming languages out there, and almost all of them are able to read this and reinterpret it, like in JavaScript's case, back into an object. In PHP's case, it can interpret it as an object or an array. But every programming language is able to take this and interpret it into a structured format that they can use easily as a list or an array or an object or something like that. And so it becomes this generic way to pass information back and forth without worrying about, does that server, is it run the same programming language that mine is? Okay, so it's very popular with AJAX to pass strings back and forth. And so we're going to do that here. We're going to take this JSON string, and we're actually going to ask it to return a JSON string, actually. And so we're going to use a getJSON method, and it's a little bit different than some of our other ones. We're going to take this out because we're going to use it a little bit differently. And I've got another page on our server that is called json.php, and when you make a request to it, it's going to by default return a JSON string. And you can see right here what the string is going to look like, just a key value pairs. Remember that when we talk about a key value pair, we're saying that the first part of each pair, each one of these is separated by a colon. The first part is a key. It's like the unique identifier. It's the handle for that second piece of information. Which in this case is teacher, or we could say student, stuff like that. So let's come back to our example here. So we're going to return it, and then we're going to use another jQuery method called .each. Okay. Now again, you're going to see this is another method that we're not actually assigning to a variable or to a selector, because we're just wanting it to loop. Just like in JavaScript, we learned about loops, that we could use for loops and things like that. .each is jQuery's way of doing that. And with this method, we pass in the data that we want to loop through, and then we say here's a function that we want to execute on each piece of that loop. Okay, so when this becomes interpreted back into an object, we want it to loop through once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's for each one of these key value pairs we want it to loop through. And we can also, each will pass some information in, and so we can say, okay, it's going to pass in 2 pieces of information. And if we set them up to receive them in our function, then we can use those, and it's going to pass in the key and the value. So that's going to make it easy for us to interpret it. The getJSON method automatically converts, not only retrieves it from the server, but also automatically converts it back into an object, so we don't have to do that manually. And so when we come in, we say .each, we loop through our data, we're running this function on each one of them. And so let's say that we came in and we wanted to assign it to the body again. Just append it to there. And we're going to use some bad code, but we're going to pretend that we're appending it to a table, and we're going to append rows to it. Okay, so I can say in the first cell that we put the key. We close that cell, open a new one, and then we append the value. So we're just creating one long string where we append information, little bits to each one of them. And we come in, we say we close that cell, and we close that row, and we close append. And so now you can see down here that even though our HTML would not be specifically correct, we do have each one of these broken out into different table rows. Alright, so let's look at another example. We mentioned that we might go through how to use this, use AJAX in combination with a form. So let's look at this form here. We're going to be able to submit information, assign a rating, and assign whether they're a student or a teacher. and we want to submit this information via a form to that same test.php page that we originally created. Now if we look at it now, it just, well, actually does work. Let me refresh this. I had forgotten to take the code out. Then I could say it's going to submit, but it doesn't actually do anything. And so we want it to say, instead of reloading the page and submitting that information somewhere, we want AJAX to capture that, prevent the form from submitting, and actually go ask test.php to return a string based on the variables that we submitted. So let's go over here and look at our HTML. You'll see this is the HTML for that form we were just looking at. And I've gone ahead and put in document.ready down here, so we're ready to go. So on that form, we're going to create an event listener. And let's see, it says that we have an ID of form, so we can use a selector like that. We're going to use an on event listener. And we're going to use submit as our event keyword, because we want, when this form is submitted, whether they click on this button or whether they hit enter on submitting it or they submit it with a screen reader or something like that, no matter what, when they submit it, we want an action to be called. So we're going to set up our function as the action that we're going to be listening for. And close that function, close the method and the line. And one thing we can do that we haven't done before, and this is optional, is that we can ask jQuery to send into that function an argument that contains the event that we're listening to. So when it's fired, we can modify that event. And the reason we do that is so that we can put in some code called event dot prevent default. And that allows us to say, okay, when the form goes to submit, because that's the default action, it's going to reload the page and either go to a page that the form's submitting to or post back to itself. We actually don't want it to do that. So we're trying to prevent the default. So once we've prevented it from reloading, then we come in and we use, we can use .get method to do something. And in this case, we want it to load test.php. We want to submit an object. And I'm going to jump around here a little bit. And I would say when it's done, I want it to submit to a function, pass in the data as an argument, the data that was returned from test.php. Alright, so we've got that. Then we need to fill in our object of all the information that we want to pass through. In order to do that, we want to not define it statically, but we actually want to pull in the values from what people, when they clicked on the radio button, which one, what value did they select? When they hit the drop down, what value did they pick? And of course, what did they type into the name field? So we do that. We can set 3 variables. So we say name, we want it to do something. We want to grab the rating, and I'm just going to leave these empties and then go through each one of them. And then we want to retrieve the status. Okay. So let's look at the first one. We've done this before. We've selected a text field, and then we said .val, and that's going to return the value of whatever we select. So we're going to use, you'll notice that up here there's not actually an ID or a class or anything like that, but we can still use a CSS selector that selects based on the attribute. Okay, so we can come in here and we can say I want to select an input field that has a name attribute that equals name. Okay, so that's going to match this right up here, and only that one, because that's the only one that has an attribute, a name attribute that equals name. And so now we've retrieved the value of whatever has been entered into that field. Then we come into rating. We're going to do it just a little bit differently, but not too much. Now we've got a bunch of radio fields, and we've actually got 3 with the same name, and we want to retrieve the value of the one that's actually been clicked on. And so we can do that by saying input name equals rating, similar to what we just did earlier. Now this will select all three of them, but we want to select the one that was checked. And so we can use the checked selector to select only that one. And then we do just like we did on the previous one and get the val method of that to retrieve the value of whichever one they've actually clicked on. Then we come in for the drop down, and this one's very simple. We come in and we say, we use select, and it has a name equal to status. And we don't have to, even though we've got multiple options here, we don't have to figure out which one is creating a value, because what happens in HTML is when someone selects one, when they click on it and select it in that drop down, it assigns the value to the select tag. So if we come in here and say .val on the select tag itself, then it's going to select it just fine without having to worry about it. And so at this point we come into our object and we assign those values to the properties that we want, which are going to have the same name. So in this case we're going to assign name equals name, rating equals rating, and status equals status. Alright, since we use the same names throughout. Now you'll notice that I use quotes on this. You don't have to, but it is possible within an object, a JavaScript object, to use quotes or not use quotes. The reason I did it here is to differentiate between this being the name of a property and the variable that we've been using called name. So we don't want to get those confused. We don't want it to assign a variable incorrectly. So we're saying this is actually the property name that we want, and then this is the variable name that contains the value we just selected. Alright, so now we've selected them, and we need to do something with the information that gets returned. So we could just alert the data back out, see if it alerts correctly. So I'm going to save this. And we're going to go back to our page and refresh it. So now, if I select these three things and I hit submit, instead of the page refreshing, it's going to alert what the information that was returned from the server, from the test.php. Okay, just as we would want it to. Alright, so I mentioned that it is possible that there's a workaround that allows us to retrieve information from a remote server, and it's a little complicated in how it does it, but just like we can include a remote script, in this case, for instance, over here we're including a script from ajax.googleapis.com, and that's going to run fine. We can fake that and actually retrieve the JavaScript or the JSON string wrapped in a function and pull that in via a script or via the script tag like we've got here, and then use the JSON string that it pulls in. Now that's probably a little bit confusing, and that's okay. We don't have to worry about it too much, because in jQuery it handles all that for us, and we do one little change to our getJSON method and it pulls it in just fine. So we're going to go ahead and add in here our always present document.ready, create the function, close the function, close the method, and the line. And so in this, we're going to do very similar to what we've seen before. Get JSON. We're going to want the json.php file, except this time we actually need it, since we're working on jsbin.com, which is on a completely different server. We need to reference the full URL. And so where was our URL? So in this case, this is our full URL, cmat.tntech. You can see that all the way through. And then we have to add in a parameter called callback equals question mark. And that is basically a flag that for all intents and purposes lets jQuery know that this is going to be a remote call. You have to make some changes on your server to how the JSON is returned. That's already been taken care of. So as far as the front end goes, you just have to have callback equals question mark, and jQuery is going to handle it from there. So then I can come in and say function, here's the data I want to receive, and we're going to execute something inside of there. And we could say, of course, have our .each that we pass in just like we did before. We pass in data, we pass in the function that we want to do something with. Inside that function, we still have our key value pairs, so we can reference that information easily. So inside of our .each loop, we're going to assign some information. So let's do it correctly since we can easily edit the HTML now. Let's go ahead and add in a table tag, and let's say give it a little bit style so we can see it better. This is the old-fashioned way to add style inline, not necessarily the best idea. But then in this case we can say, let's just append the information to the table, and then we'll do just like we did before and actually append table rows to it. So we've opened the row, we've opened a cell, we append key to it, then we close the cell, open a new cell, append the value to it, and then we close the cell and close the row. So if we've done this correctly, when I run with JS, then we're going to see that it creates a table with a key in one and the value in another, and it returns the entire list there. Alright, so that pretty much covers everything that we want to talk about right now as far as AJAX goes. I've shown you a couple different methods that you can use to retrieve information from remote servers or from another page and pull it in. You can override forms, and so at that point you have all sorts of functionality that you can build into your projects. So we want to look at one other extra little thing, just sort of a side note if you will, and let's see if I can find it here. Right, let's pick one slightly different one. Yeah, this will work fine. Okay, so this is just a little side note that we touched on at the end of class. And in try.jQuery, they mentioned that it's faster to use submethods to retrieve information. So instead of using a dot selector like this, it says dot class, that it's faster to use a method. And that didn't quite sit right with me. And so I was kind of curious about it. So I ran some tests, and I just want to kind of show you what we're doing here, and then kind of make a few points here. So with this script, what I'm doing is I'm getting a date object. JavaScript provides a date object, and from that there's different methods that we can pull from that, one of which is getTime. And that pulls in from a set period in time, sometime in 1970, the number of milliseconds that have occurred since that set time. I believe it's called the Unix epoch. And what that does is allows us to compare two different strings of time and get the difference between them very easily. Okay, so we've assigned the value of x to be the number of milliseconds since the Unix epoch, and then we're going to do something. Then I'm going to grab a new date, get that time, and then in the console I'm going to return the difference between those two. And so the difference between those two is going to be how long it took to run this particular operation. And in this case it's using .selector and .children. Then I do the exact same thing again. I get another date, get the number of milliseconds from that current time. Then I run some script, and then I get another date, and I'm going to output to the console another number, which is the difference of how long it took from here to here. Okay? So let's turn on the console. I'm going to up this up a little bit. We've got two for loops here that are going to run through 10,000 times. They're going to run through this HTML over here and try to select the three that have a selector as well as a div with a class of class inside it. Okay, so it's a fairly simple operation, and we're going to run it 10,000 times the way it was originally recommended, and then we're going to try it the other way and see how well that works. Okay, so let's run it here. Takes a little bit, and then we get back two numbers. So as we said, the first number is how long it took for this block of code to run, which is using the subclass, and the second number is how long it took for the second block of code to run, which is 144. Now what do those numbers actually mean? Those are milliseconds, so that's saying it took about half of a second to run through and select those elements 10,000 times, and it took 144 milliseconds, or just over a tenth of a second, to retrieve it 10,000 times using the multiple classes down here, just like we would as a CSS selector. So obviously doing it this way is not faster. It's actually 3 or 4 times slower. Now the point was not to pick on try.jQuery. In some cases, I'm sure there are times in which it might be reversed and it could be faster. But the point is twofold. Actually, to point out when someone says something is faster or slower, makes a claim, sometimes it's worth checking it out. And so I just kind of want to show you one way that you could test speed using the date object, and also to demonstrate a little bit more of a practical point. Sometimes in programming it's really easy to get caught up in always do it a certain way because it's faster, but it's not necessarily better. Or we also have to ask, is it worthwhile? Okay, we've run 10,000 times through this document and it took less than half of a second. On the browser side, speed becomes, at that kind of speed, just selecting 1 or 2 selectors, it's so fast that there's not really any viable advantage to doing it one way or the other. We're never going to notice a difference. It's not going to make a difference in browser performance. And so the other thing that we're trying to point out is when someone says something's faster, not only do you test it, but you say, how much faster? Is it worth it? Now, if this code was running on a back-end server, say we're using PHP or Python or Rails or something like that as our back-end programming language, and we saw a difference of 445 milliseconds versus 144, that can make a difference. Because on a server, you have, say you've got 10,000 visitors, they're all coming to one server, making 10,000 requests to that one server at one time. But when you're running JavaScript like this, it's running on you have 10,000 visitors, it's running one time individually on 10,000 different computers. And so the amount of load is not nearly as relevant. Okay, so when we actually deal with, there are libraries that have graphic elements to them, JavaScript libraries that allow us to say do things in 3D or something like that, really graphics intensive stuff. And in those cases, efficiency does matter. It matters a whole lot, because if you're trying to render 1,000 or 10,000 data points on a 3D object that you're trying to rotate in live, performance can make a difference. But when you're just doing selectors like this, sometimes it doesn't. And so the point is to always build code that solves problems, not just worry about performance. You should know when performance matters and when it doesn't. And I believe that's it for today.